Hello, I'm Pastor John of the North Carroll Cooperative Parish of the United Methodist Church. We are so glad that you have made your way to this last episode of Family Feud, presented by NCCP On Demand. We have made it to the end of September in the parish, and it's the fourth week of this series where we're looking at the genesis of conflict. We've learned quite a bit along the way, and I encourage you to watch the previous 3 episodes if you have not already done so, to catch up and to see where we are in this series. But we're going to conclude it here now by looking at the story of Joseph. We are looking again at the beginning of the Bible, the first book, which is Genesis. Last week we looked at Jacob and Esau and how they were fighting over their father's blessing and the ordeal of that conflict, and how that came to a resolution, and how Jacob became Israel, and the rest is history. This week we're looking at the conflict of the sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, and we are into the longest story of the patriarchs in Genesis. Basically, save 2 chapters, the Joseph story is going to last the remainder of the book of Genesis. And so that's one interesting part here. It's also a pivotal story in the people of God's history. This is how, in fact, the people of Israel are going to end up in Egypt in order that they can be delivered from Egypt. Remember, Moses is going to go to the Pharaoh and lead them out of Egypt and into the wilderness, and eventually the people will make their way into the promised land. Well, for all that to happen, first of all, we have to end up in Egypt, and this is the story of how that happens. It's a continuation of a theme that we discovered in the first week of this series with Cain and Abel, and then it was re-emphasized last week with Jacob and Esau, and that is sibling rivalry and reversals. This is the story of who's going to take over the family, and we would expect, as tradition and culture and ancient customs would have us to think, that the oldest son, who happened to be Reuben, the oldest son, would take over this job of leader of the family, but that is not the case. We're going to see here another great reversal. And so to get us set up for this rivalry and this issue, this conflict, this family feud, we're going to look at the results of the parish survey. We surveyed 100 people, and we asked them, what types of things do people get jealous of? And so we had the 5 most popular answers. Number 5, sometimes we're jealous of other people's families seeming to be happy and having it all together. And so we get jealous of other families. Number 4, maybe we get jealous of people's houses. They have a nicer house than us or a bigger house, and we get jealous. Or maybe their house is just put together and nice and neat and tidy. Number 3, just overall material things. We get jealous of things. People have stuff that we don't have, we get jealous. Number 2, a new car. There's nothing like that new car smell, especially a new car smell that haven't had 5 kids riding around in it. And then the number 1 thing that we still get jealous of, and this is a human thing, is money. You have more money than me, or you manage your money better, and we want it, and we get jealous over that. The problem with jealousy is, A, it's a human emotion or human problem. It's a me problem. And so when I'm jealous of you, when I'm jealous of something you have or something you've done or something that you're having done to you, that's a problem internally. It's that evil that lurks internally, and it's a me problem. And it's common. None of us can escape the idea that we're jealous. And if you don't admit it, then you're having a second problem called lying. We have to deal with it. And it's how we deal with it that matters. Jealousy by itself is harmful to us, and it's not where we're supposed to be in terms of our gratefulness with what God has given us. But that's one thing that can be dealt with. It's a real problem when it causes us to act out towards others or towards the person that we're jealous of. And that takes many forms, and it leads to many bad behaviors. That's where we get the concept of bullying, really, quite frankly. In many cases, not all, but in many cases, bullying at all levels, age-wise, has to do with I'm jealous of you. And we talk about the serious problem, no jokes, but serious problems of bullying that happens with our young people, with our kids. And what rarely gets said is that bullying is modeled by adults. And so kids see us bullying each other in the workplace. They see us bullying each other on TV in terms of politicians and news people and entertainers. They see our coaches bullying one another. And then, unfortunately, they see it at home. And so they see models of bullying from their adults in their life. It's no wonder they bully each other at school. I joke that I get bullied at home by Pastor Melissa. And sometimes I'm afraid of her. I'm joking, of course. I'm not afraid of her, but she does bully me. Usually because she's right and she wants me to do something that she knows that she's right and I'm wrong. But anyway, we'll get beyond that. And so in this case, in the case of Joseph, this sense of jealousy goes a long way in terms of bad behavior. And what happens is, and I'll sum this up quickly, but you need to read Genesis 37, really the rest of the book, but especially Genesis 37. And here's what's happened. Joseph is not the oldest. In fact, he's one of the youngest. He's not the youngest, but he's one of the youngest. And he has a series of dreams. And as he's dreaming, he goes and tells his brothers not once, but twice about these dreams that seem to indicate that he's been given a vision from God that they are all going to bow down to him. And so, again, not once, but twice. And so you can imagine how put back his brothers were. And so, they had a little bit of jealousy. It says in verse 11 of 37, so his brothers were jealous of him. This is outright in our translation. His brothers were jealous of him. And so that was an issue. And so the brothers went from 0 to 60 in terms of their actions. They didn't internalize this jealousy. They were going to bully their brother in a major way. In fact, their first plan was to kill him. And then they said, well, maybe we could throw him into the pits, then we shall say a wild animal. And so they backed off of that plan because they didn't want his blood on them. But we can make it look like a setup. And so they go through this terrible plan and he ends up not just in the pit, but he ends up getting sold into slavery and taken into Egypt. And then they take these blood and this goat blood, again, irony from the last story. They take this back to his dad and tell him that, oh man, he's been ravished by a wild animal. And so his dad grieves his loss. And so it's just one terrible step in this process after another, all because the brothers were jealous. And so they didn't talk it out. They didn't just get some space like we learned last time. They didn't deal with this jealousy in the right way. They went 0 to 60 and back in terms of dealing with this to get rid of their brother. And so it's a terrible, terrible story that causes grief for Joseph's parents and the family extended. And it's just a terrible way to treat anybody. But we're talking about family feud here, their own brother. And so it's just an awful time in the story of Israel. And so the issue for us today is, how do you respond to people that are not just jealous of you, but act out against you, and in this case, in this terrible way? How do we deal with family feud or conflict when people are acting like this? Well, we can learn a couple things quickly from Joseph, and then we'll move on. But first of all, I love this new song by Taylor Swift, the Shake It Off. And I don't know if you're a Taylor Swift fan, but I have young girls in the house, and so I get to listen to Taylor Swift. And I know that one of the lines says, haters going to hate. And so she's just going to shake it off. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it off. Well, basically, that's what Joseph does. He shakes off their bad behavior. And so he's sold into slavery. He shakes it off. He ends up 5 minutes in Egypt. He ends up in jail. He shakes that off. He ends up working for the Pharaoh, the foreign king. Shakes that off. And he rises to the top in all these situations. And yeah, he has some internal struggles along the way, I'm sure, and he misses his family, and he wishes he was back home. But he always seems to just shake it off. And so it's a remarkable thing. And I know that's easier said than done. And you can't just tell your 8th grader to shake it off, and they're not going to just be happy with the bullying at school. Or maybe you have a family member or a coworker that these kinds of things are happening to you, and it's easier said than done just to shake things off. But that is the model here that we have from Joseph. And so it is one way, if that we can be strong enough in who we are. That's why it's so difficult for a middle school person, is because they're not strong in who they are yet in some cases, in most cases. But if we're at that point in our life where we're convinced about who we are and in terms of the image of God that we're created in, then we might be more capable of shaking things off like Joseph. And he does a remarkable job in the most dire of straits. And so he even shakes it off in prison. Even after he starts to interpret some dreams in prison, and the winemaker and the bread maker or whatever, the head chef, they're supposed to remember him. When they get out, they forget and leave him back, or the one guy leaves him in jail for 2 years before he remembers that he's a dream interpreter. He's got a connection with God. And eventually that's what gets him moving on up in the government of the Pharaoh, and ends up being a good thing. But he keeps shaking it off. Later in the story, when his brothers, it's a big irony in chapter 45, his brothers come over to Egypt because there's drought in their land, and they hear that Egypt has some supplies. They come to Joseph unknowingly. They bow down to him. And so the stories come full circle. When Joseph realizes who they are, he's in a powerful position, both literally and metaphorically here, or spiritually here, powerful position in the government, and so he could have them all killed. And he's also in a powerful position that they are actually bowing down to him, not knowing that that's who he is. But instead of revenge, or at least acting out on them, yeah, he gives them a little test or two, but he greets them with peace, and he makes peace with them. And so the second part of this is that we got to come to some peace. And the language that he uses here is that he's starting to figure out that all these things have kind of worked out in his favor, and that he has an ultimate purpose, that regardless of what his brothers did or didn't do, his ultimate purpose, he was going to live out God's will. And so he comes to peace. In our situation today, again, when somebody's acting out on us, seated in jealousy, not only do we shake it off, but we got to come to a place of peace, and peace with God, peace with ourselves, and then trying to make peace with others and taking the initiative. Again, easier said than done. But Joseph gives us here the model. Finally, the last part to lift up here for Joseph is ultimately, and really all the way through, he just maintains and comes to realize when it's all said and done, this wonderful verse he gives us in verse 20, when because one last time his brothers try to make things bad, or they lie, and they say, hey, guess what? Before Dad died, he told us to tell you that you had to forgive us, Joseph. And Joseph hadn't done anything along the way since they reunited to indicate that he was going to act in revenge. All the opposite. He extended peace, remember? But anyway, he says, stop doing this. Am I in the place of God? Don't be afraid. And verse 20 is the key verse. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. And what a powerful place to be in. Talk about being in a place of power. What you intended to do to me is bad, but God intended it for good. And this is the response of all responses. The response par excellence. What you intended for evil, God made for good. And so through all this, he could look back and say, hey, I needed to go to Egypt in order to save you and my family. Because it was his time in Egypt that allowed him to get with the Pharaoh to save the Pharaoh's people because of the drought that was coming, and convincing him to put some food away, and then having enough left over to actually help his brothers and his family out. And so the irony of all that, in terms of his brothers thinking he was dead after all, or trying to sell him off at least to be forgotten, in all actuality, they moved him into Egypt so that he could save their lives. And Joseph recognizes that at the end. And what a great place. When we go through struggles or family feuds or conflicts at work or in the schools or wherever we might be in conflict, we try to shake it off along the way. We try to make peace with God and with ourselves and with the other. And ultimately, at the end, being able to look and say, you know what, that person did mean me harm. But God had something good to come out of it. All right, and so don't confuse that and think God puts you in a bad place, or God puts me in a bad place to make something good. No. Joseph says, you tried to put me in harm's way, but it was God that did the great reversal. And if we don't learn anything else from these family feuds in Genesis, is that our God can perform these great reversals, especially when we least expect it, or we are least capable of doing it on our own. Joseph was a slave. Joseph was a prisoner. Joseph was a foreigner. But it was Joseph that rose through all that to the top and saved the people of Israel, just as they're getting started with the story. And so I encourage you again to study these family feuds in Genesis and see if we can glean some proper responses and ultimately get to that response par excellence. Although you intended to harm me, God intended it for good. And what a wonderful place to be able to be at peace with God, peace with ourselves, and peace with others, even in the midst of coming out of a family feud. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of NCCP On Demand. Our next teaching series begins next week, and it will be on sharing life, a different way of looking at evangelism. May God continue to be with you in everything you do this week. God bless.